there's a certain type of person you've probably encountered before. Maybe it was a friend, a colleague, someone in a group discussion who always seemed a little too confident. At first, they sound reasonable. They listen, they nod, they even agree with parts of what others are saying. But then, slowly, something shifts. The conversation moves forward. Facts are exchanged. Examples are given. And suddenly they introduce a theory. Not something anyone else has heard before. Not something grounded in what was just said, but something that sounds intelligent enough to stop the room. It's subtle. They don't say, "You're wrong." They say, "Well, if you think about it differently," and just like that, the rules of the discussion change. What's strange is how confident they sound while doing it. They'll bend a detail, reinterpret a fact, ignore context, not because they don't understand it, but because understand it would mean losing the argument. So they create something new, a theory that only works if you accept their logic, a conclusion that only makes sense if you forget what was said 5 minutes ago. And if someone points that out, they double down. They explain louder, longer, with more certainty, because this isn't really about being right. It's about not being wrong. Psychologically, people like this aren't arguing to discover truth. They're arguing to protect something fragile, their self-image. For them, disagreement doesn't feel neutral. It feels threatening. If someone else is right, then something about them must be wrong, and that idea is intolerable. So instead of adjusting their view, they adjust reality. You'll notice how quickly facts become flexible around them. A statistic that contradicts their point suddenly becomes outdated. An example that disproves them is just one case. A lived experience that challenges them is emotional or biased, but anything that supports their position, no matter how weak, suddenly becomes definitive. They don't deny facts outright, they rearrange them. What's interesting is that many of these people genuinely believe their own arguments in the moment. They're not always consciously lying, they're rationalizing. Their brain is doing something very specific, protecting their sense of competence. For many of them, being right became tied to worth very early in life. Maybe they were praised for being smart, maybe mistakes were punished, maybe being wrong meant embarrassment, ridicule, or loss of respect, so they learned a rule: being wrong is dangerous. And once that rule is internalized, every disagreement becomes a battlefield. Not because the topic matters, but because the outcome does. This is why they often escalate arguments that don't need escalation. A casual debate turns intense, a difference of opinion turns personal, because on some level, they're not defending an idea, they're defending themselves. You'll notice how uncomfortable they get when cornered, when their logic starts collapsing, when the room goes quiet, when someone calmly says, "That doesn't add up." They rarely pause to reflect. They pivot. They introduce a new angle, a new hypothetical, a new theory, anything to avoid sitting with the possibility that they might be wrong. And the most telling part, they often accuse others of doing exactly what they're doing. "You're twisting things. You're changing the subject. You're not being logical." Projection becomes their shield, because admitting fault would mean confronting something deeper. The fear that without being right, they don't know who they are. Over time, this pattern creates distance. People stop engaging deeply with them. Discussions become shallow. Conversations turn cautious. Not because others don't have opinions, but because it's exhausting to argue with someone who keeps moving the goalposts. And slowly, without realizing it, this person becomes isolated in discussions. Not excluded, just not taken seriously. What's tragic is that many of them are intelligent, curious, capable of insight, but their need to win overrides their ability to learn. Because learning requires humility, and humility requires safety. And deep down, they don't feel safe being wrong, so they choose control instead. Control over the narrative, control over the conversation, control over how they're perceived, even if it means distorting reality. But here's the psychological cost nobody talks about. When someone constantly reshapes facts to protect their ego, they lose trust, not just from others, but from themselves. They stop knowing what they actually believe. They stop distinguishing truth from defense. They stop growing. Every argument becomes a performance. Every discussion becomes a test. Every disagreement becomes a threat. And the irony is this: the very thing they're trying to protect, their intelligence, their credibility, their authority, is what slowly erodes. Because people don't respect those who are always right. They respect those who can say, "I was wrong." But for this person, that sentence feels like collapse. So instead, they build theories, not to understand the world, but to survive it. Understanding these patterns matters. Not to judge them, not to shame them, but to see what's really happening beneath the surface. Because when someone bends reality to win an argument, it's rarely about arrogance. It's about fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of being diminished, fear of losing value in the eyes of others. And until that fear is addressed, no amount of logic will change their mind. Because logic was never the point. Winning was. And winning for them feels like survival. That's why these arguments feel so intense, so circular, so draining. You're not debating ideas, you're witnessing a defense mechanism at work. A mind doing everything it can to avoid the one thing it learned long ago was unsafe: being wrong and still being worthy. Understanding these dynamics, how ego disguises itself as intelligence, how fear masquerades as certainty, how arguments become identity. That's what we explore here at Retro Mind. We look beneath behavior, we name the patterns, we separate truth from protection. Because when you understand why people argue the way they do, you stop taking it personally, and you start seeing the argument for what it really is. Not a search for truth, but a struggle to feel safe.